All right. Sorry about that, folks. The whole system crashed on me. I'm not sure what happened there. Looks like we're back up online. And sorry about that, folks. Apparently the computer wasn't quite ready to come back from the holiday vacation. The whole thing just shut down on me. So my good luck with computers is continuing to hold strong. Apologize for that. So we were talking about buckskin cordage. Now, buckskin cordage is really good stuff, really strong stuff, really easy to make, but it tends to produce a very large seam if you are sewing your clothing together like that. And of course, most of the sewing, most of the clothing that I make, most of the bags and items that I make out of buckskin that I sew together, I use buckskin cordage for a couple of reasons. One, it stretches the same way as the clothing does when it gets wet. It wears at the same rate, especially in things like moccasins, so it tends to be very durable. But there are just some places where a big chunky seam like that isn't what you want. And especially if you're making clothing for cold environments, which our Ice Age ancestors definitely needed, because well, even with a fairly mild Wisconsin winter like we're having this week, it's cold outside. If I go outside without any of my protective clothing on, I've got a half hour, maybe 45 minutes before I'm gonna freeze to death. So for that, we need a finer seam. We need a finer cordage. We need thread. Now, a couple other things that thread is very useful for, of course, spears and arrowheads, tying fletching on, finer, more carefully crafted jewelry, small beads. None of these beads would fit on a buckskin string. So we really need a finer material. Now, our next cordage material, again, very easy to source for our Stone Age ancestors because, of course, every time they got some kind of food, they'd get rawhide, they'd get buckskin, assuming they tanned their rawhide into leather, they'd get sinew, tendon. Now, sinew is really, really easy to process, but it's got a couple of quirks like rawhide. It's fairly stiff stuff. Now, this is a tendon from a white-tailed deer hind leg. And we had delicious venison. This one's from last fall. I guess fall before last now, 2019, 2018, last year. Anyway, doesn't matter. It's been around for a while. It stores easy as long as you keep it dry. It's really, really long-lasting, durable stuff. Like the buckskin, it's extremely strong. And rawhide like this is what was being used to make spears, arrows, darts, knives, and warm clothing. Now, all we have to do is separate some of these fibers. And initially it starts out as kind of a thick lump like this. You'd actually take and bash it between a couple of rocks or a couple of sticks to really separate these fibers out, like on the end here. And once you've got fibers separated, you just pull them apart. There we go. And this is basically ready to use thread or binding. Now, the tricky thing with sinew is that it does work just fine the way it is, the way it comes off here. But it's a little stiff, can be a little itchy, can be a little difficult to work with. You actually have to chew on it. See, it's full of something called collagen. And collagen is like a natural glue. If we take a bunch of sinew and rawhide and chop them up into little pieces, boil them in a little bit of water, that collagen will come out and we can actually use that to make what's called hide glue. Pull out all the fibers and the gooey stuff, and you basically have like a white Elmer's glue kind of a glue. Really good stuff. Probably wasn't used up until the last 15,000 years or so. It's hard to make if you don't have pots, like ceramics, but that's a whole different program for a whole different day. And to make this usable and pliable, we actually take it and chew on it. And I mean, yeah, it's dried out tendon from a deer. Believe it or not, it kind of tastes like beef jerky. I wouldn't want to have to eat it, but it's not all that terrible. Now, if I have some binding that I need, something say that needs to be reinforced, all I have to do is take this and wrap it around that spot that I need to be reinforced, that I need to be bound together. And it actually sticks to itself. It sort of self-glues. Get up, focus, there we go. And so it'll hold something like an arrowhead or a spearhead in place very, very well. And of course, since it's much finer material, I can take and I can get all the little fibers to stick together, just like threading a needle with thread today. Sometimes it's just not cooperative. There we go. With that now, I can take that rawhide, go and sew my clothing together, and as it dries, it'll bind to itself. It will tighten up just like the rawhide, and actually make very, very tight, very, very close-fitting seams, and very, very strong seams. The sinew is actually strong enough that if you're not careful and give yourself enough space from the edge, you can actually rip the seam out where it'll pull through the buckskin without breaking. It's really good stuff. Now, the materials we've been talking about so far, of course, all come from animals. Rawhide, buckskin, sinew. Most of the string that we're going to be familiar with is going to be like this guy. So this is my unofficial assistant, runs from scissors. You might know his cousin Wilson. Now, string like this, of course, we can get all over the place. Hobby stores, craft stores, hardware stores, Walmart, Target, pretty much anywhere you go, you can get some kind of thread or string or rope or something. Of course, our Ice Age ancestors had to make all of this stuff, and theirs was usually sourced from local materials. Now this is a fishing line, quite a long fishing line, and this was made by me at a park in Antigo. Now, I ended up at this park kind of hanging out because we only had one car available at the time, and my wife had it. We had separate errands to run, and I ended up finished early, and so I'm hanging out at the park for a couple hours, and I get bored. So over an hour and a half, I made about 10 feet of fishing line, and this little, we call a gorge hook here. I went fishing with this, and I actually caught a couple of bass with it. And that's all done with local plant materials from right here in north central Wisconsin. Now, a lot of the stuff that we get at the stores, of course, is going to be stuff like jute and hemp, and of course, those will work. Now, around here, we're going to be looking for plants like these. Now we've got milkweed and dogbane are really, really good. Those are actually what I use to make my fishing line. Nettle, which I'm going to show you in a second. Flax, which is linen, which some of you are probably familiar with. Agave here, agave, is actually a very, very common landscaping plant. You can find it in hardware stores or gardening centers, growing and ready to put into your landscaping as a kind of a decorative plant. They come from the Southwest, but I've seen quite a few of them here in Wisconsin, just in people's yards and pots. Now, the agave plants are really neat because you can pull out a fiber attached to a thorn from the center of the leaves, and it's sort of a ready to go needle and thread. That's sort of a rare thing. We don't get that around here. Now, our string, if we're going to make our fishing line today, we're going to start with stinging nettle. Now, stinging nettle is a personal favorite of mine for cordage because it's everywhere, it's easily accessible, and almost nobody complains if you want to ask them if you can go into their backyard or side yard and clear out all of the stinging nettle that they have so that you can make string. Do be careful if you're clearing out stinging nettle because, as the name suggests, it does actually sting. Nettles are a really important plant historically. They're edible with some cooking. Cooking will remove the bulk of the sting, and they're very, very nutritious. They were used by Stone Age peoples anywhere they were available, and they're very easy to process. So these have been dried out. You can do this fresh, you can do this green. Peel all the leaves off of the stem, and it's a very woody, very stiff stem. Actually take and smash that stem flat. We want to go from the sides and the top so that it's really well separated. And then get a thumb in there and actually spread it out, actually lay it open like this. And a little section at a time, we break that wood, that stem out of there, and separate it from the bark. The bark of the nettle plant is where we get our fibers. Now, this is the first step to any plant fiber string technology. And there are a lot of plants around here, not just the ones I showed you the pictures of that you can use for this. Do some experimenting, and you might find something growing in your own backyard or your own side yard. Basswood, linden trees work very well. Willow bark was actually used to make some of the oldest nets that we've ever found, fish nets. And we'll be talking more about nets in a few minutes here. Cattails work pretty well for sort of a bulky, temporary, sort of short-term use type of rope. Now, you can spend hours and hours and hours just preparing fiber by peeling branches and twigs and plant stems free of bark like this. Well, since we don't have hours and hours and hours, and the computer already tweaked out on me once here, we're definitely not going to spend the next 6 or 8 weeks just peeling plant fibers. But you can see now, if we help this along, how we gather our fibers. Now, this can be used to make string, to make binding as is. We're going to do what's called twining with this and make a 2-ply cordage or a 2-piece, 2-part cordage. That's what most of the string you're going to be familiar with from stores is going to be. Or we can take it and refine it down more with a process called retting. Now, retting is something that's necessary for some fibers, not so much with nettles. We take this, all of this bark that we collect, and put it in a vat of warm water. Leave it for a week or two until it smells absolutely horrible, like old lettuce and dead fish. Pull it out, rinse it off, and well, at that point, it ends up looking like this. Like something you would find in the drain after a shower. It looks pretty gnarly. Now, I promise none of this is hair from a drain. This is all nettle fiber. This has been processed and retted, and you can see it's still got some splinters in there, so use with caution. But once you've got your fibers like this, you can start making string. That's what we're going to do next here. Now, for some plants, like I said, like nettles, milkweed, and dogbane are really, really good. You can just peel the bark right off of the plant and start making it into string. You don't actually need to go through this retting process with all of these plants. Now, some things like flax, linen, you really, really do, or you'll get a very, very sort of a clumpy, splintery, very rough kind of a rope. Now, what I'm doing here real quick before we start making string is something to make this process a little bit easier, a little bit faster, so I hopefully don't bore any of you. I am just pulling out strips of fibers that are relatively long and relatively straight. If you've ever done any work with wool, which is another cordage material we'll talk about in just a minute here, you have probably become familiar with carding. That's essentially the same thing. If I'm doing this in a true primitive setting, I'll be using something like this. This is a scapula, a shoulder blade from a deer, and it's pretty worn down now. It's been used a lot. You can see the teeth here, and that's actually for pulling those fibers through to help get splintery, gnarly bits and pieces out of there that we just don't want when we're making our string. Now, to make this into string, I'm going to start with our good long length of fiber here, and this process will work with any long fiber you have, and actually it works pretty well with just other pieces of string that you want to make into bigger, thicker pieces of string. Now, the first thing I'm going to do is struggle to show this step on camera. I'm actually going to take and put my leg up on the tree here. I'm going to roll this up just a little bit to kind of smooth this out, to pull all of these fibers together. And it doesn't have to be real tight, something that's going to kind of resemble like a loose yarn. Now, once I've got it to that stage, I'm going to fold this in half, but not in the middle. The reason I'm going to do that is because I'm going to be splicing in another piece of material. And that's how we actually take and make a piece of string, a piece of cordage that's longer than the materials that we have available. Now we're going to adjust our setup just a touch here real quick because I want to be able to show you this on camera. The way we make this into string is we take and twist our top section here. And it doesn't matter if you twist it clockwise or counterclockwise, as long as you twist your top and your bottom sections the same directions. Now you can see I've got them pinched between my finger here, and I'm twisting them. And when I let go of this, it twists together. Now what I'm doing here is twisting the two plies, the two lengths of fiber, and putting them under tension. And by twisting them that same direction, when they unwind from each other, they wrap back up against one another. That's called twining. And this is the simplest way, the earliest way to make a 2-ply or a 2-piece, 2-strand string or cordage. Now, hopefully that's showing up okay on the camera. You can see we've got a good bit of string going here. Now, with a little practice, you can get very quick at this. When you're first starting out, I would recommend that you keep it very simple. You do a twist on the top, a twist on the bottom, and then a twist on your string. And if you twist both plies, both top and bottom, the same direction, your string will automatically twist itself up. Yeah, again, it's a little trickier to do this on camera. I hope everyone can see this okay. Now that is, about 5 inches, 4.5 inches of string. And you can see it took a minute to make it. Now, if you want to speed things up a little bit, then you can do that on your leg, where we take and see if we can get it here. We would take and roll that across our leg, and it sort of twists as we go. But it's much easier to do down on your lap than it is up against a wall. So hopefully you'll forgive me if I don't demonstrate that very well. Now, to splice these together, to take and make a piece of string that's longer than just the 6 inches of this half of fiber that I've got, we have to add more material. So we're going to go through our preparation step, just like we did before. We're going to take that and sort of twist it up, roll it up, get it all stuck together so that it's in sort of a yarn form, a semi-coherent bundle of fibers. Then there's a couple ways to do this, but the way that I prefer to do this was actually, I first saw it from a fellow named Dave Canterbury. Runs a survival school down in the Southeast. You might know him from a Discovery Channel show called Dual Survival. Kind of a high energy guy, but when he was making string, instead of just lining his ends up on the splice and twisting them together and continuing to make the string, which is how a lot of folks do it, he actually takes and puts a little bend in the end of his material and puts it right into the crook, right into the meeting point of his two portions, and then continues twining. That way, both halves end up as part of that, both halves of that string are gripping onto the new material, the new splice, and that makes it, we can get this off camera for a second, there we go. That makes it much more difficult for that splice, that addition, to get pulled out. And you can see the only way you can tell where I added those new materials, or that new length of fiber, is that it's just a little bit thicker. You get just a little bit of a lump there. And that's just a normal, unavoidable part of making string, even by machine. You'll find if you're looking at store-bought strings and cordages that sometimes they have a thick or a dense spot. And that's a splice where they've actually put new fiber, new material into there. Now, you can tell you need to do that when you get something like this. And you can see I have a thick strand and a thin strand. And the thick strand isn't wrapping evenly around the thin strand. The thin one's kind of vining around the thick. That means that this length here has gotten too thin and I need to add more material. So it's that same thing we did before. I'll take and roll this up. There we go. Kind of splice that together just like we did before. And apologize for doing this off camera. Just don't want to spend all afternoon making a single piece of string. And you can see it, there we go, evens right back out. You can see where the splice started right here. Now, with a little bit of practice, you can get very, very quick at this. I know we've been doing this for what, probably 5-6 minutes, maybe a little longer, and I've got 6 whole inches of string. Now, if you're going to make something out of string, you're going to need a lot of it. It's going to take a lot of time to twine that string. You can make your own string out of harvested plants, out of cotton balls. If you get felting wool like this, or if you actually have your own sheep and can just get wool, doing this process with wool is how you make yarn. Wool, animal fur, even I've made bits of yarn string like this from the fur that was shed on my hands from petting a friend's husky. Any fibers that you can get can be used to make string or twine or cordage like this. The longer the fibers, the easier it is and the faster you can work because you're not constantly adding in new materials. But once you've got that string, it opens up an incredibly large world of potential. Like I said, string cordage right up there with fire and a sharp cutting tool is some of the most important inventions, the most important tools that mankind ever conceived of. It's one of the 3 technologies on which everything we have today is based. Sewing, lacing, fishing, trapping, hunting, boats, we call it tump lines, netting, weaving, bags, so on and so on and so on. It's all made possible or made much, much easier with the addition of string. Now, weaving as we think about it today goes back at least 40,000 years, but it didn't start out quite the same way as modern cloth. A couple examples to show you here. Now, modern cloth made on a loom, woven, is fairly simple, and the technology to do it goes back at least to the Neolithic. So we're talking more than 5,000 years ago, probably all the way back to 10 or 12,000 years ago. Now, with modern cloth, like my scarf here, this was woven by me on a primitive loom. It can absolutely be done. It's got a warp and a weft where you have fibers that run across each other. Like any of you can probably look at your shirts or your pants or your socks and see exactly this sort of thing. A tablecloth, a couch, we all know modern cloth. But to do that, you have to have the loom. Though a loom isn't really complicated technology, it can be very difficult to build under primitive circumstances. And way, way back, most people are still wearing buckskin clothing. They don't have to weave large pieces of cloth. So weaving actually looks like this. Now what this is called twine weaving or twining, and it's actually done the same way we were just making that string, except with every twist of the string that we make, we run a piece of string or a stick or fibers, depending on what we're making, across that. So I'll try to get the camera to focus on this up close. Each one of these lines is made up of 2 pieces of string, and you can see they always wrap counterclockwise. And that wrapping holds the warp so that the entire bag stays together. Just like cloth, if you cut across that, it'll unravel. Now this particular bag is actually a part of a little foraging bag. It would hang from a necklace or a string around my neck like so, and is used to gather stuff like clams, mussels, rocks, you know, crayfish, that sort of thing. Another example of that, just out of reach here. This one actually has a bit of a bottom where it's been woven together in a more modern fashion so that it sits flat. This is full of rocks. Now, these rocks are very special rocks. They're all about twice the size of a grape, more or less football shaped, very smooth and dense, heavy rocks. They're mostly quartz and granite. And the reason for that is a hunting tool that string allows us to produce. Now, the braided lengths here are made of hemp cord, have a finger loop on one end, and some of you probably recognize this already. This is a sling. Hold the knot on the other end, and the pouch in the middle is actually sewn right into the twine. Now this particular style would be what we call an Apache sling. Now, this is a really common style from the American Southwest, and it works really, really well. Now I'm gonna take my shorter length one here because I can actually kind of show you how this one works without breaking a window or knocking a display over. Now we'd take, like so, there we go. Now if I throw this rock, I just take it and I chuck it, I can throw it somewhere in the 50 to 60 mile per hour range. I'm definitely not a pitcher for a professional baseball team, but definitely hard enough and fast enough to do some damage, particularly on something small, like say a partridge or a ptarmigan. Now if I take that same rock and I put it in this sling pouch, it works like the atlatl, the spear thrower. It adds that much length to my arm. And so at the same amount of force put into it, I can actually throw it twice as fast as I could otherwise. And centrifugal force holds the rock in place until I let go of that end and send that rock flying at over 100 miles an hour toward the target. Now I will offer a disclaimer here, though these are very easy to make. They have been used for more than 10,000 years and are very effective hunting tools. There are peoples that have been documented to hunt animals as large as deer and fight off wolves. They were used in warfare by the Romans, by the Persians, by the Greeks, even by some Native American tribes. I do not know how to aim this hunting tool. I cannot hit anything accurately with it. So if you do take some string and try to experiment with a sling, great deal of caution is very important. They really, really do work well. I would honestly suggest sticking with something simpler like a catapult. Now, another kind of weaving that is much, much older that most of us probably wouldn't actually think about as a type of weaving is braiding. Now this is a simple 3-ply braid. This is just a carrying strap, sort of an all-purpose thing. It works as a belt, a canteen strap, carry meat, bags, whatever. It's just a piece of ready-made cordage. The braiding makes it many times stronger than the individual strands of the material, in this case buckskin. Each buckskin strand can hold about 40 pounds of weight, but braided together, this can hold about 200 pounds. I can climb this like a rope. And the reason for that is that the braiding makes the workload focus on a much shorter piece of material. And that essentially makes it much, much stronger without adding bulk to the material. Now, the Native Americans, particularly in my area, took that to the next level, and we find examples of this in other parts of the world too. This is a braided sash. Now, this is called finger weaving. This is all done without a loom, just lots and lots of string and time. The color differences here are done with natural dyes so that you can really see how the pattern forms. If we follow the edge, here you can see this strand of string weaves up and down just like you'd weave on a loom, except the weft line that it's weaving over is the purple one here that comes out like so. We actually split these into 2 even bundles. You take a line from the right side and braid that through the left, then you take the line from the left side and braid it through the right, back and forth, and it gives you this flat woven length of cloth, but it's entirely braided. It's very, very strong. You can see in the middle here where it started, it creates sort of a diamond pattern. Now amongst the local Native Americans, these were used a lot for belts and for carrying straps. Some other places like Scandinavia, Eastern Europe and that sort of thing, they'd actually take strips of them and sew them onto the edge of their clothing for decoration. You can definitely do both. If you want to look into finger weaving, there's a lot of good information out there on how to do it. It's not very complicated. It can be a little difficult if you're making a big piece. Definitely time consuming, but a lot of fun. Now, one last of the many, many, many things that cordage and string allows us to do that I want to talk about is netting. Now, nets are incredibly important to our ancestors. Originally, probably just used to make bags like this. And I use net bags for quite a few things, especially in the summertime when I'm fishing and gathering, carrying things that are wet that I want to dry. This particular net bag, fits very nicely over the hoop on a stick to turn into a dip net. I do like what you'd catch frogs with or fish with. And then after I'm finished with it, I take the hoop off, tighten it up, and use it as a carry bag. Now, nets are a really good example of an important technology that comes along with string that's often overlooked, and that is knots. Knot making or knot tying is a very important skill to have. Every single point on any net is a knot. Now, to make your own net isn't really complicated. We don't have a whole lot of time to go over that. It would really be an entire program unto itself. There are some very, very good instructional videos on YouTube and lots and lots of books out there on making fishing nets. The oldest nets that we have artifacts of go back more than 10,000 years. They were being made out of willow bark. You can see this is a future net bag that I've started here. To make a net, you need a couple of things. You need a net needle, a gauge. It doesn't have to be shaped like this. It can be just a piece of wood with a notch on either end so that you can wrap string around it. Just something to spool together your string that's long and narrow so you can fit it through the loops of the net and give you more than a foot of string at a time without getting it tangled up. The size, of course, will vary depending on what kind of net you're making. You want your net needle to be equal to or a little smaller than your gauge. The gauge can be anything of a smooth, even shape like this. The ruler works very well. And that is to keep your net loops the same size. Keep everything even. Now, I will show you this. This net here is about 4 feet long and about 2 feet from top to bottom. This net is entirely hand tied and made completely out of stinging nettle fibers that were harvested, hand twined, and then tied into a net. Now, initially I was hoping to make a complete fishing net with this, and I will tell you that after several months of work, I was a little discouraged that this was all I managed to make. Most of that time was spent making the string. So if you do want to make a net, absolutely recommend buying the string that you're going to use. Now, we're going to show you this here real quick, and we'll have time for some questions. If I can make the right knot here. There we go. Talk about the importance of knots and then have trouble tying a knot. All right, here we go. Now, the knot for making a net is important to get right. It's not a very complex knot. It's what we call a sheet bend. Now, bear with me, I'm going to be doing this backwards so I can show it to you correctly. Now, you would come in from behind the loop on the previous row. You're going to make a loop in the direction that you're going. So you're tying the net that way. Wrap around and come out the loop. And we tighten this up just a little bit so that it's not so sloppy, and I'll give you a closer look here. It's much easier to do not backwards. Here we go. Now this knot is called a sheet bend. And as we tighten that, it locks itself in place because of the way it ties together. The loop from the previous row here and the knot for the sheet bend are both stuck in place, and that's what makes a net work. Those loops don't slip. They allow sort of a flexibility depending on the angle they're being pulled, but they hold in place very tightly, and each strand shares the load of whatever is caught in the net or being carried in the net, so it makes it very, very strong. That technology was extremely important for, in particular, catching food. Now, I heard my alarm go there. We're running a touch behind with the computer issues we had. I know we've talked a lot about a lot of stuff here today. Haven't even gone over half of what's possible with cordage, with string, with weaving. If any of you have any questions, first go ahead and chime in. I'll be happy to answer them. Hopefully you've learned a little bit about the importance of string today. Excuse me. Yeah, go ahead.
I built a stone tool. It's a knife.
Oh, nice.
It's pretty sharp. I'll show. The knife. It's not very big, but I wasn't actually trying to make a stone tool. I actually was just playing around, and I threw a rock against the rock, and this broke off. And I grabbed it, and it turned out to be pretty sharp.
That is awesome. Yeah, that is probably how some of the very first stone tools were actually discovered by our earliest ancestors more than 3 million years ago. That's awesome. Look at that.
I think the same type of blue rock you were using. I just think, I'm not sure.
Yeah, it looks similar.
It,
So
when I
Wisconsin, you might have a piece of chert, which chert is a type of flint, a type of knappable stone. I'm always really happy when I find a piece. Could also be something called basalt, which I use a lot of around here. It's not usually as great, but as you can tell there from your piece of paper, it definitely works. That's awesome. Way to go.
some flint, I think. I got some big chunk of flint.
Very cool. All right.
I think I do.
If anybody else has any questions, go ahead and chime in. All right. Well, if not, then that's all right too. I want to thank everybody for joining us over these past weeks for our program here, and for making it back to today's program, bearing with me with the technical glitch. Again, sorry about that. We really, really appreciate everybody joining us here at the museum, and despite all of the craziness with 2020, continuing to show an interest in everything that we're able to share and present here. Fingers crossed that this year we'll be able to welcome you back into the museum in person to see all of this face to face, and much, much more, hopefully. Again, we really appreciate you joining us here with Colossal Fossils. If you want to know more about the subjects that we've been talking about, absolutely go check out your library. There are thousands and thousands and thousands of pages and books written about natural history, paleontology, archaeology, experimental archaeology, and so on. I cannot recommend highly enough diving into it and checking out a few books. As always, never stop learning, and thank you again for joining us. Happy New Year, and best of luck in 2021 to everybody else. We hope to see you again in the future. Bye, everybody. Thanks for joining.